Chapter 13. If you have the book, it's the bottom of page 56. We need a little bit of a recap of what this chapter is talking about, and we have to address a question, which is a burning question that we have had right since the beginning of learning Tanya. It is the question about how could you have an individual who is one of the most spiritual, most advanced individuals in the whole of Jewish history, who undoubtedly, without a doubt, without a drop of question, undoubtedly was one of the holiest people, undoubtedly was a tzaddik, and yet didn't think so. How does that happen? So we asked that question all the way in chapter 1. Now we're in chapter 13, which is a long way down the way, and it's about time we came to address this question. How could somebody who is so connected, who is so spiritual, who is a tzaddik, without question, not only a tzaddik, but the tzaddik of his generation, how could he have such a misguided or inaccurate self-assessment to believe that he is just an ordinary person? In the conversation that we're going to have around this story and around this individual, we're going to touch on the possibility of tzaddik simulation. You know, we live today in the VR world. Everybody's talking about virtual reality and augmented reality, and you put on the goggles and you have a different experience, and you know, you're transported to some other reality, and things which are not real appear to be real, etc. So there's a synthetic environment that a person could live in. There's a simulated environment that a person could live in. So is it possible to simulate the experience of being a tzaddik? Imagine you could pop on a serious set of goggles and you could simulate what it is to be a tzaddik. I think that'd be an amazing experience. I don't know if you'd ever want to take off the goggles, but that's a different issue. So that's going to feed into the conversation that we're having around this particular individual who looked in the mirror and did not see himself. He saw a lesser version of himself. And we want to know why that is. Okay, by way of introduction, let's remind ourselves what we have established in this chapter and in the build-up from the previous chapter. We've established that there's something called a Beinoni. The average Jewish person is very familiar with the term tzaddik, even if they don't have a good definition for the word. But the people are familiar. We know what a tzaddik is. We know that a tzaddik is a very elevated person, somebody who we aspire to become, or at least we wish to respect, or we hope to have a tzaddik in our lives. We understand that the tzaddik is ultimate. And then we know that on the opposite extreme, we have something which is called a Rasha, and we understand that we don't really want to go that route, and we don't want to be a Rasha, and it's a bit of an insult to call somebody a Rasha. And in our minds, at least before we learn Tanya, Rasha's a bad guy, bad person. Tanya helps to ease our conscience a little bit and say, you know what, it's quite possible to be the most wonderful person on earth and still be a Rasha. It's possible, because the definition of a Rasha is simply somebody who doesn't align with what Hashem wants 24/7, and who, of the nicest people, the most learned people that you know, align with Hashem 24/7. Fine. The term Beinoni is the one that is the major revolution of Tanya, because before a person studies Tanya, they think, a Beinoni, that's just an average human being, an average person like you and I. I'm a Beinoni, you're a Beinoni, we're all Beinonim. You know, that's pretty much how I think everybody understands it until they are exposed to Tanya. And this chapter started with last chapter, and this chapter we have revolutionized the concept of the so-called average person, the individual who is middle of the road, the person who is somewhere between the tzaddik and the rasha. We've completely revolutionized what that is. And here's what we have learned so far. First of all, we've learned that a Beinoni is somebody who does not actually contravene anything of the Torah. That means in order to achieve Beinoni status, a person never does an Aveira. They never transgress. And that doesn't only mean that they don't transgress in action, because we know that we are multi-layered beings. They don't transgress in speech either. So a Beinoni never lies. A Beinoni never speaks Lashon Hara. A Beinoni never curses or speaks negatively about another person. A Beinoni doesn't use bad language. So now you're listening to this and you say, wow, okay, a Beinoni is quite an impressive human being, and I'm not even sure if I know Beinonim, let alone Tzadikim. But then we said it's actually more than that, because the Beinoni, not only does the Beinoni not do something which is contrary to the Torah, not only does the Beinoni not say something which Hashem would not approve of, but the Beinoni does not even entertain a thought which a Jewish person should not have. And the key word over here is entertain. Entertain a thought means this. All day long, multiple times a day, thoughts flash across our brains. That doesn't necessarily mean we entertain them. Just because they flash across the screen doesn't mean we entertain them. There could be self-defeating thoughts. There could be thoughts of anxiety. There could be thoughts, God forbid, of heresy. There could be thoughts of inappropriate behaviors. But we know from our own experience that just because a person has a thought does not necessarily mean that the person is actually going to behave that way. We also know from our own experience that if a thought is unhealthy, we have the capacity to dismiss it rather than to entertain it. Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. Sometimes we flush out the bad thoughts immediately. Sometimes we allow them to linger and to cause damage. The Beinoni never falls into that trap. The Beinoni never allows the negative thought to linger. So what have we learned? A Beinoni is ideal, is aligned in behavior and in speech and in thought. That is the definition of a Beinoni. Then, one of the critical things that we learned in this chapter is that in spite of all of that, and with the Beinoni's accolades, with the Beinoni's achievements, and with the Beinoni's self-control, and with the Beinoni's focus, in spite of all of that, the Beinoni is not a Tzadik. Why not? So the key factor that we said that distinguishes a Beinoni from a Tzadik is not a measure of what you do and don't do, but rather what your internal process is like versus what the Tzaddik's internal process is like. So the Beinoni, like the rest of us, has these occasional tempting thoughts that invade their head, and they have enough self-control not to allow them to take hold. Whereas the tzaddik never has those thoughts in the first place. So that's a major difference, and we used the expression, we said that there's a mahus, there's the essence of who the person is, which is shifted in the case of a tzaddik and not shifted in the case of the Beinoni. We even went so far as to suggest that a Beinoni goes through life doing all of the physical things that the rest of us do, eating, drinking, sleeping, enjoying the materialism of this world, and all of that makes it, that the person is very much a citizen of planet Earth, which is, of course, a place that is susceptible to all kinds of inappropriate thoughts and so on and so forth. So that's essentially where we've got up to so far. And where we're going to start this evening, like I said, the bottom of page 56. It's 2 lines from the bottom of the page. It's not. It's actually the last line on the page. On page 56 on the screen, it is the 5th last line on the screen. Second word on the line. That's where we're going to start our conversation this evening, is with the word aval. Aval bat. Bat obviously is a qualifying word. So aval, we're going to qualify something about the Beinoni, which is bat, be Beinoni, in the reality of the Beinoni. The Beinoni is not like a tzaddik. What is a tzaddik? We already said just a couple of lines earlier. We said that a tzaddik is somebody that liboy cholol bekirboy. That's a paraphrase of a verse that King David uses. Liboy, his heart, cholol bekirboy, is empty inside of himself. What does it mean, an empty heart? Doesn't, God forbid, mean that he has no passion or that he has no empathy or anything like that. It's rather that, if you remember earlier on in chapter 9, we spoke about the fact that the nefesh elokis, the godly soul, primarily operates through the brain, because the nefesh elokis wants to first understand the value of something, and once it ascertains that something is worthwhile, then it will make an emotional commitment to it. Whereas the nefesh habami says, what does this feel like? Which I'm sure you'll recognize is very much the primary way in which people in the 21st century tend to operate, right? How does it feel to you? How does it make you feel? People are constantly saying, I don't feel this is appropriate. I don't feel safe. I feel this is the right way. So that's Nefesh HaBahamis talk. Nefesh HaBahamis talk is let's see where the heart goes, and based on that, we'll try and build a philosophy around it, or we'll try and justify it in some way, or we'll try and modify the legal system to accommodate it, or whatever the case is. That's the primary operating mechanism of the Nefesh HaBahamis. So when the Tzaddik says, or rather when King David says that the Tzaddik has an empty heart, it means he's empty of that emotional attraction that normal people have. So, as we've already discussed, the tzaddik is not the person who walks down the street and sees something which is tempting and thinks, oh, I wish I could have that. Doesn't even enter his mind. Whereas for the rest of us, that could actually be a real consideration, and then we have to manage the process and make sure that it doesn't actually take hold, and that it certainly doesn't translate into behaviors. So that's the reality of the tzaddik, and that's why we're saying over here, aval, but, because by comparison, the Beinoni does not have that experience. Aval be Beinoni. So what is the reality of the Beinoni? Hu derech mashal, the nature of the animal soul, and by extension the Yetzer Hara, all the negative distractions, the toxic behavior, the toxic thinking, etc. in the Beinoni's reality, even when the Beinoni is at peak performance, that part of the Beinoni, hu derech mashal ke'adam sheyashen, is like somebody who is asleep. What happens when somebody's asleep? They don't become a better person. Think of, I don't know why it comes to mind, like almost like a Tom and Jerry cartoon, where Jerry's sleeping and Tom is like trying to sneak past, and they went the Zoom. So, you have a look at that, and you say, so when a cat is sleeping, is it now no longer a cat? When the cat is sleeping, is it now no longer a threat to the mouse? No, it's still a cat. It's just sleeping. So when the Yetzer Hara, or the Nefesh HaBahamis, the animal soul, is asleep, does that mean that it's no longer an animal soul? Does it mean that it's no longer Yetzer Hara? No. It's just sleeping. So that's the reality of the Beinoni. The Beinoni's experience is, right now, I'm in a safe space, because right now I'm not being bothered and agitated by my Nefesh HaBahamis, by my animal soul. I'm in a good space right now. It doesn't mean I become a good person. Obviously the Beinoni is a good person, but I'm saying I haven't become this perfect specimen of the human being. I just have, the ogre is sleeping. So right now there's some peace and quiet in the house. But I should never make the mistake of thinking that because we've tranquilized the beast, therefore there is no beast. That's not correct. What's the nature of sleeping? At any time you can wake up. That's what it means to sleep. To sleep means at any moment you could wake up. And maybe you can even wake up grumpy. Could be that the Nefesh HaBahamis that's now been deprived for a period of time from having its say and having its input, maybe it's going to wake up in a little bit of an angrier mood, or it's going to push harder to try and compensate for the fact that it wasn't in control for a period of time. So the allure of the sleeping animal soul is that it could convince a person that the animal soul is out of the picture. No, it's just energizing. And it's going to come back with force. Like anybody who's had a sleep, you wake up, you're rejuvenated. You're ready for the film. You bring it on, right? So that's the Nefesh HaBahamis. Kach ora beBeinoni. So the same thing is with the negativity inside the Beinoni's experience, which is what we call the Nefesh HaBahamis, or the negative side of the Nefesh HaBahamis, the animal soul, or what we call the Yetzer Hara. All of that. So what could happen is it can also go into a period of sleep, and eventually could wake up. In the left side of the heart, which we have used as the metaphoric home and place of the animal soul. So everything is asleep over there. I'm going to say welcome back to the Zoom people. I think everybody else was still on the Zoom. It was just me who got bumped off. There you go. I'm unmuted. Don't panic. So, I got bumped off the Zoom, but I'm back. And hopefully we'll be able to stay on the Zoom. I did make a little disclaimer up front that the internet has been very patchy today. And if we get dropped off again, just don't disappear. Hang in there, because please God, I'll be able to reconnect very shortly afterwards. So, what are we talking about? Well, there's a great example. I'm using an example of a comic strip. Who needs an example of the comic strip? Use the example of the Zoom. So what happens? You're in the middle of a Zoom, and you're busy learning with people. By the way, just want to put out a little advert for those people sitting here in the room. They don't have this problem. They did not get disconnected. We were able to, to continue. But the bottom line is this. If you are on the Zoom, and then the Zoom disconnects, for whatever reason, the internet disconnects, and now you're no longer connected to the Zoom. All of you were still there, right? You were all still in the Zoom. It's just me who disappeared. I'm not even sure who Zoom arbitrarily chose to become the host in my absence. But the reality is that you were all there, and I had the impression that you all disappeared. It's almost like the child who covers their eyes and says, you can't see me. So it's the same level of misunderstanding that a person has when the Nefesh HaBahamis goes quiet. You say, if it's gone quiet, maybe it's left. Maybe it's no longer here. No, Beinoni. That's not how it operates. It's just sleeping. And if it's sleeping, the nature of sleep, by definition, means the possibility of waking. Right? By definition. If you're asleep, there's the possibility of waking. So, likewise, in the same way as a sleeping giant or a sleeping beast could at any time wake up. So too, in the Beinoni, the Ra, the negativity, whatever toxic side of the Beinoni is asleep at a particular point in time. It is ki yoshen b'chala smoli. There are times when the nefesh habahamis goes to sleep. When is that? When does the animal soul go to sleep? I don't know. My experience, I don't know when it goes to sleep. I feel like the animal soul is working 24/7. Some of us, even when we're sleeping, you can feel that the animal soul is still working, because the nonsense that comes through in the dreams makes it feel like, okay, then the animal soul is still working. So when does an animal soul sleep? I got news for you. For the majority of people, the animal soul neither slumbers nor sleeps, if you'll excuse the paraphrase. Right? It's always active. It's always looking. It's always out to get us. And there goes the zoom again. And it's constantly conniving and looking for an angle and trying to schlep us down. When does an animal soul sleep? So an animal soul sleeps when a person, and we're talking again specifically about a Beinoni, when a person is in a very deeply connected state. The only thing that can make an animal soul fall asleep is when a person is in a profound state of connection to Hashem. Because when that happens, when a person's in a profound state of connection to Hashem, it automatically tranquilizes the nefesh habahamis, the animal soul. That's just how it goes. So when is that? So he tells us, B'shas kriya shema utfilah, that is during the time of saying the Shema and during the time of the Amidah. Those are the two key times where the Beinoni is so deeply connected. We've already spoken about this, that the Beinoni's experience of prayer is very, very different to our experience of prayer. And in our experience of prayer, I don't want to cast aspersions on anybody and their experience of prayer, but the average person, the experience of prayer is like an unstable Zoom connection. 1 minute you're speaking to God, the next minute you don't know what happened. Everything just went blank. And then you look around and say, oh my gosh, how did I get 5 pages further in the Siddur? I don't even know how that happened. But the Beinoni does not have this problem, because the Beinoni's experience of davening is very deep, very meditative, and very connected. So it's literally like when the Beinoni is davening, like they've been plugged into a high-speed fiber cable with God. That's basically what happens when a Beinoni davens. So there's so much connection, there's so much light, there's so much clarity, there's so much awareness, the Nefesh HaBahamis is tranquilized, or overwhelmed, or bamboozled, or sedated. That's when the Beinoni's animal soul is asleep, as long as there's davening happening. Now, we could have a taste of this. We could have a sample of this. For example, we've just had Yom Kippur not that long ago. Come on, you have to acknowledge that at some point on Yom Kippur, you get so caught up in the fervor and the excitement and the meaning and the spiritual connection of the davening that you actually lose sight of yourself. It can happen, right? Hopefully it does happen. You actually lose sight, you lose track of time, you lose consciousness of your hunger, because you're completely enwrapped in this experience of davening. Now, the Beinoni does not wait for Yom Kippur for that to happen. The Beinoni has this experience daily, multiple times a day. When the Beinoni is saying Shema, if I'm an outside observer and I'm watching the Beinoni is completely immersed in the Shema. It's a deep experience. It's a meaningful experience. It's a transformative experience. It's a connected experience. And the same applies, obviously, when the Beinoni does the Amidah as well. It's the same kind of principle. So during those periods, the Nefesh HaBahamis darted, sleeping, out for the count. Why is that? Sheli boyer be'ahavas Hashem. Because the experience that the Beinoni has during davening is the experience of a passion that is a flame in the Beinoni's heart. A passion for Hashem that is alive and burning. Now, here's the thing. The way that human beings are designed, we are incapable of feeling passionate about opposites. Just can't happen. So, for example, I bumped into somebody yesterday. They were just walking out of a restaurant. So there's two options, right? RTG, there's two options. There's a milchik section and there's a fleishik section, meat and milk. So knowing this individual, I said, I'm assuming that you had a good steak. So they said to me, actually, I had a pizza. I was like, I thought that you were one of these real, fleishik warriors. One of these individuals who that's your passion. And because if that is your passion, and actually I know somebody like this, if you serve them a dairy meal, they look at you like you've committed some kind of a crime, because they're so passionately carnivorous that the suggestion of a milchik meal is heretical to them. That's the way humans are designed. When we are embroiled in passion about something, it is impossible to simultaneously be sucked into something which is the opposite. It just makes no sense. Cannot happen. So you get a lot of people who are very moderate and very meek and very middle of the road. Okay, so they can flip-flop between various things. But somebody who's deeply passionate about something, whatever is contrary to that passion, it's got to get out of the way. When the Beinoni is davening, the degree of passion towards Hashem and to that connection with Hashem is so intense, there's no room for the Nefesh HaBahamis to even squeak in a message about maybe we should be doing something else. Like when we daven, let's be honest, when we daven, we're thinking, what time are we going to get to the meal? Right? What time are we going to get to the Kiddush? That's what's going on. Because unfortunately, the degree of passion that we have for our davening is not, burning. It's whatever we do it. We kind of believe in it. We're committed. We're maybe a little bit enthusiastic. The Beinoni is so passionate in the love of Hashem that is generated through the process of prayer that there is no opportunity for the Nefesh HaBahamis to even raise a suggestion. Nothing. It's out for the count. In that experience, the Beinoni simulates what a Tzadik always feels like. A Tzadik is always in a passionate love connection to Hashem. At all times, in all scenarios, regardless of what the Tzadik is doing. Which incidentally, and this is a completely a side point, but just to illustrate the point, you could get a Tzadik doing something that for the rest of us would be absolutely mundane. And for the Tzadik, it's a passionate experience of connection to God. It's a fascinating thought.
So what you're saying, when the Beinoni reaches that level, are they a Tzadik?
No.
Do they reach the level of a Tzadik?
No, they don't. So when the Beinoni is in this experience of davening, the Beinoni is not a Tzadik. This is very important information. The Beinoni does not become a Tzadik. The Beinoni is simulating a Tzadik experience in a very three-dimensional, tactile, visceral, virtual reality. But it is not the Beinoni's reality, because the minute that davening is over, the passion subsides and the hard work begins again. So the Beinoni has not become a Tzadik. The Beinoni has simulated the experience of a Tzadik. V'achar kach, after davening ends, after they close the Siddur, what happens to the Beinoni? Yachol liyois choizer v'neor. Then what happens is the Nefesh HaBahamis, the animal soul, wakes up. Thank you very much for allowing me an opportunity to rest. I hope you enjoyed your davening. Quite frankly, I actually endorse it. You can do it. I don't mind. Do your thing. Take your hour, take your 2 hours, do your thing. The rest of the day is mine. I would like you now to listen to some of the things that I have to say. Now, again, the Beinoni is not going to listen to those things. But the reality is that the woodpecker is going to start again. Do this, think this, say this. During davening, none of that happened. Ve'lochen, with that information, we could address this burning question that we've had since the beginning of Tanya about an individual called Rabbah. Now, Rabbah is not the kind of name that you give your child at birth, right? Rabbah is a name that is attributed to him, which is very common in the Gemara, to represent his stature. You see that with quite a number of people. You see Abaya and Rava and Rebbe, etc. There are a whole lot of people where the name that is used to refer to them in the Gemara is not necessarily their birth name or their personal name. It's a name that represents their gravitas, their persona, their spiritual prowess. Rabbah means great. So the fact that he is called Rabbah illustrates that he is of the greatest of all of the sages of the Talmud, and without a question, the greatest person of his generation. So right at the beginning of Tanya, when we were trying to understand what a Beinoni is, which is what launched the whole conversation of what becomes the first 53 chapters of the book of Tanya, so we spoke about the fact that there's a tzaddik, and we spoke about the fact that there's a rasha. We quoted various places from the Talmud and from Kabbalistic sources, etc. And then we raised this question. Can we honestly accept that a Beinoni is somebody who does the wrong thing at any given time? And the goal of the Alter Rebbe in the first chapter of Tanya was to completely dismiss that possibility, and to effectively guarantee us that a Beinoni can never do something which is contrary to what Hashem wants. So then he asks the question, how then in the Gemara do you have a story where Rabbah, who is the greatest man of his generation, who was such an advanced person spiritually that the Gemara reports that eventually at the end of his life the angel of death was unable to take his soul because he was just so intensely holy and spiritual, and he never stopped learning Torah for a moment. And we know that the rules of the game are that as long as a person is studying Torah, the angel of death has no power over their neshama. So the angel of death had to come up with a whole scheme to turn him into a fugitive from the law in order to be able to get him to a point that he would stop learning Torah for a moment so he could take his soul. Rabbah stands in front of his students, who, let's just be clear, were also of the greatest sages of Judaism. He's not speaking to a class of first graders. And he says to them, Kagoin ano Beinoni. I am the perfect example of a Beinoni. Sitting in the yeshiva that day, like every other day that Rabbah gave a class, was his nephew, a man also referred to by a name in the Talmud that is not his birth name, Abaya. Now, anybody who's familiar with the Talmud, you'll know that you can't go like 3 pages in the Talmud without encountering the name Abaya, one of the most prolific contributors to Jewish law, one of the greatest minds of the Talmud. So Abaya says to Rabbah, how could you suggest that you are a Beinoni? If you are a Beinoni, none of us can live. It's quite a harsh expression, but effectively what he's saying is there has to be a tzaddik in every generation, what we call Tzadik Yesod Olam. There's got to be one super tzaddik in every generation who effectively is the foundation on which the whole of existence rests. And if there isn't such a person, then the world's going to dissolve and disappear. So if you, Rabbah, who are the greatest person in the generation, by all accounts, nobody's going to debate that, and you say that you're only a Beinoni, then the implication is that there is no tzaddik, that's it. And besides that, we're told that a person who is a rasha is never really considered truly alive, because to be truly alive is to live with your neshama, not just to live with a transient human body. So if you, Rabbah, are a Beinoni, then by implication we are all Rishoim, because none of us is as great as you. And if we are all Rishoim, how do we survive? So Abaya is shocked at the suggestion that Rabbah sees himself as a Beinoni. Our question then, which we're now revisiting tonight, is what on earth was he thinking, Rabbah? The most common answer that people want to suggest is actually the weakest answer, and that is people want to say he was being humble. Rabbah was being humble. Yeah, what's he going to say? Hey guys, I'm an example of a tzaddik. You want to know a Beinoni? Look at so-and-so. So he's being humble, he's saying, I'm the Beinoni. That is a terribly weak answer for 2 reasons. Number 1, because that's a total misunderstanding of what humility is. And number 2, that is a total undermining of what teaching means. Just let's use a different context for a moment just to illustrate the point, and especially because it's related to the parish of this week, so it's appropriate to talk about. We know that there are a whole lot of places in the Torah where the Torah will use language that is long-winded but positive rather than language that is direct and negative. Right? So for example, in this week's parasha, when it talks about the animals that were going to go into the ark, it says that Noach had to take the animals which were Tehorim or Tehoira, the pure animals, which effectively means kosher animals, just that there was no concept of kosher just yet, so they called it pure animals. I mean, later in the Torah, they'll also be called the pure animals. And then, from the animals, asher einena tahira, which are not classified as pure. Now, there's a much more efficient way to say that. Just say the impure animals. So the Gemara tells us that the reason the Torah does this is to teach us a lesson. Wherever possible, avoid using negative expressions. Even if they're appropriate, avoid using negative expressions. So that's why you'll often find that we use the expression heifech hachaim, the opposite of life, rather than to say death. Right? Things like that. So it's always fun when we've got somebody's alarm waking everybody up in the background. So now, there the Torah is effectively showing us that you should rather use an expression that is long-winded and euphemistic instead of an expression that is direct. So that's why it says, don't use the word tameh, impure. You know how many times the Torah uses the word impure? You know how many times? In a whole host of different scenarios about food, about the various forms of impurity, the impurity of death, the impurity of tzaras, etc., etc. You know how many times the Torah uses the word impure? It's like 150 times or something like that in the Torah. But this one time it didn't use it. Why? Because when you teach, you cannot afford to use nice language that may convey the information incorrectly. When you're telling somebody, this is kosher and this is treif, then you don't say, that's kosher and that's not so kosher. Because then people think, okay, it's not so serious. You have to say, that's kosher and that's treif. You have to be clear. This kind of behavior is endorsed by Judaism. That kind of behavior is rejected by Judaism. Right? That's how you have to say it. So Rabbah gets up in front of his class, in front of these tremendous students who are going to be the future leaders of the Jewish world. They're going to be the people who comprise the Talmud. They have to have accurate information. And he gets up in front of them and says, I am an example of a Beinoni. If he does not believe that 100%, then he dare not say it. Because then he'd be a negligent teacher. Then he'd be a teacher who's giving inaccurate information about one of the most important subjects. How do we ascertain our own spiritual worth? The fact that he wants to be humble, you cannot be humble at the expense of misinformation. Imagine a rabbi who's approached by somebody and says, listen, I've got an halachic question. By mistake, I cooked the meat thing in the milk dish. And the rabbi says, I don't know if I'm qualified to answer. That's nonsense. If you know the answer, then that's your responsibility as the rabbi to say the answer. If you are a rabbi and you are the head of the generation, you're the spiritual giant, you're the one who's educating everybody, you're the one who's defining what a Beinoni is. Don't say, maybe I'm a Beinoni, and then mislead everybody. So if Rabbah suggested that he is the prime example of a Beinoni, that means he totally believed himself to be a Beinoni. And our question is, how did he believe that? Because we've already illustrated that the reality of a Tzadik is exponentially beyond the reality of a Beinoni. The reality of a Tzadik is that they never have the thought, even temporarily, flip into their mind, flit across the screen, even for a nanosecond, to do something inappropriate. Whereas the Beinoni doesn't, they have to manage it and they have to shut it down. How could Rabbah think he's a Beinoni? Rabbah knows himself. He knows he never has these problems. He knows he has no temptations. He knows that he's invested in Torah 24/7. He knows that he's living with passionate love of God at all times. And he knows that that is the definition of a tzaddik, not of a Beinoni. How does he suggest that he's a Beinoni? Says the Alter Rebbe, Velochein. Therefore, for that reason, we're now on page 58. Therefore, for that reason, Hoya Rabbah machzik atzmoi kebeinoni. That's why Rabbah truly believed himself to be a Beinoni. After loy posik pume megirsa. Even though he never for one moment stopped learning Torah. And not only that, it wasn't just simply his habit that he had, that he constantly learned Torah. We know many people who are antisocial and the way they entertain themselves is through academic pursuits. So maybe Rabbah was one of those and he just simply learned Torah all day because he didn't have a personality. No! This was his passion. This wasn't some kind of a robotic escape from society or some kind of a habit that he had formed that over time had just become second nature to him. This was his passion. With this tremendous yearning and this absolute desire and this passionate drive to connect to Hashem. With this tremendous love, like a Benoni would achieve while saying the Shema or while saying the Amidah. So the reason that Rabbah believes maybe he's a Benoni is not despite the fact that he learns Torah all day long. It's because of it. Because he in his self-assessment determined himself to be kebenoni hamispalel kol hayoim, like a Benoni who spends the entire day davening. Because what have we said? We say during the davening experience, the Benoni simulates what it is to be a Tzadik. During the davening experience, the Benoni feels passionate love to Hashem that is temporary, but it's the same kind of passionate love for Hashem that the Tzadik feels constantly. Which means theoretically, if a Benoni would spend all day, every day in davening mode, then they would spend all day, every day with absolute passion for Hashem. And if they lived all day, every day with absolute passion for Hashem, they would have no interference from their animal soul, which means they would have no thoughts which are inappropriate, no temptations, no self-doubt, and all the other stuff that plagues the rest of us. None of that would happen because their mind would be completely immersed and absorbed in this passionate love of Hashem. So Rabbah says, the fact that I don't have any of those negative thoughts, the fact that I don't have any of this toxic energy, doesn't mean I'm a tzaddik. It just means I'm filling 24/7 in Benoni mode, in the peak performance of a Benoni. A Benoni in the depths of his davening, in this passionate connection to Hashem. I'm having that all day long. You can't tell me if I'm a tzaddik or not. Nobody can tell me if I'm a tzaddik or not. All I know is the facts. The facts are I spend all day with this passionate connection to Hashem. And how do I do it? Through a method that I use, which is learning Torah all day and davening all day. How do you know that I'm a tzaddik? How do I know that I'm a tzaddik? Okay, Razal. And this is aligned with the teaching of our sages, which is, Halevai shispalel adam kol hayom kuloi. If only, right, the ideal state, if only a person would be engaged in davening all day long. Why is that even an aspiration? Why is that an ideal that the Gemara puts forward? For this reason, because if a person davened all day long, and a person davened as a Benoni would daven, and it would be this immersive experience, and it would be this deep, profound connection to Hashem, and it would be an experience of passionate love of Hashem, then that person would effectively live a simulated tzaddik life all day long. So what do we extract out of this? Firstly, Rabbah is not exaggerating, nor is he downplaying his personality and his achievements. He's not trying to play some kind of a false humility game where, no, I'm really not such a tzaddik and I'm actually a Benoni. That's not what he's doing at all. He's giving us an accurate insight into how Benoni works. A Benoni could live with enough input and enough investment and enough focus, could live a life that is similar to the life of a tzaddik. A life of freedom from any kind of even absolutely temporary distraction. The other thing that he's telling us is that the uniqueness of a tzaddik is something which is so profound that there isn't necessarily a clear litmus test for the tzaddik, certainly not from the outside. Right? We can't necessarily look at a person and say, oh, I can identify the difference between a Benoni and a tzaddik, because who knows? Rabbi is saying even he himself, he has the humility in it. The humility is to say that I'm having this constant state of connection because I'm a Benoni davening all day. Not because he doesn't believe he's a tzaddik, because he believes it's possible that a person could be a Benoni davening all day. And I think one of the things we need to take out of this is to appreciate that we don't begin to scratch the surface of understanding what a tzaddik is. We have a certain tradition and a certain degree of faith as to know who the tzaddikim are across the span of generations. But we have no concept what a tzaddik is, and we have to be extremely careful not to assign that title or that spiritual grade to somebody who just impresses us, because we could be absolutely misguided. So that's really, really valuable information to bear in mind. Often you look around and people use the term tzaddik very freely and very generously, and it sounds beautiful, but it's not necessarily accurate, because we know that there are certain roles that a tzaddik has to play, which only a tzaddik can play. There's certain things that we have to take as the word of a tzaddik, which you don't take as the word of anybody else. And so it's really, really valuable for us to appreciate that we are not experts in this field, and we rely on people who are possibly more advanced and greater than we are in order to be able to explain or point out who the tzaddikim are in any given generation and in any given environment. Okay, so what do we have at this point? We have an understanding of the fact that it is possible that a person who is so focused, so in control, so immersed in the experience of godliness, that they could simulate what it is to be like a tzaddik, and we just have to recognize they're still a Beinoni. Okay, that kind of closes off a section, so I'm going to leave the new section to begin, please God, next week.